Okay, here we go. Too loud? Less loud? Someone can hear it. Second to last lecture. We're not going to do evaluations today. We'll do them next time. Today we're going to talk about sustainability and mostly about carbon, which I try to motivate throughout the class as something I think is the biggest and most important thing that will happen in your lifetime, that hopefully environmental economics will be part of the solution and show some tools for how to move forward, and is already doing that. So mostly today I'll try and get to what environmental economics is already doing. So next week, 2 reviews during reading and review week. My idea was to schedule a review that's a little bit later, not at 8 a.m., so that maybe more people would come. I hope that works for everybody. So Tuesday, 10 to 12, but I couldn't get this room. So it's at another room, which is Burge Hall, which is across from the Campanile. It's like a physics building next to the Campanile. I'll send all this to you guys through B-courses or whatever, so you'll get it in the mail, but I hope that works for most people better than 8 in the morning during review week. And then this is my regular, so in this one I'll go through lecture style, doing like the 15 graphs that you need to know, and we can just talk through the basics of those. And then in the office hours, I'll have that big room for office hours, and we can go through, just work through some problems together and think about what it would be to answer those problems. So I hope that works for everybody for next week. I can talk more about studying for the final on Thursday, and we can do evaluations on Thursday. So today I'm going to talk about sustainability in the beginning a little bit, and this will tie in with the next lecture as well, which is tied in with the last chapter in the book about green accounting and green GNP, and sort of does the path of pollution change over time and over the course of development. Today I want to talk about our policy for carbon emissions, important to motivate a new graph that's called marginal abatement, which is related to the marginal abatement curve that we already have, but now we have one that's just for carbon. And talk about cap and trade for carbon versus carbon tax. We've had indications to do each. Right now in California, we're starting cap and trade. But for carbon, it's a global problem. We need a way to look at a price of carbon globally, so we have some indications of what a global price for carbon can do and what the California carbon market can feed into that or not. So starting with sustainability. So this will tie, as I said, into the next lecture, which is talking about different pathways for development over time. There's a lot of things that come up in this class where pollution was really bad in the past. We've gotten to have environmental economics to help us figure out environmental problems. So some environmental problems have basically been regulated, not necessarily solved, but ameliorated by taxes. Sulfur dioxide is less, acid rain is less. The ozone problem has been regulated. So in these, we're looking through time and through generations at sort of trade-offs between consumption, production, investment decisions for current generations versus decisions for future generations. And every time that we had new regulations on pollution, we say, oh, this is going to drastically reduce our output or drastically reduce our consumption, but it's going to be some sort of trade-off towards better environmental resources for future generations. So we have some balance going on between generations. There's 2 criteria for sustainability. There's strong sustainability and weak sustainability. So in strong sustainability, we can separate things into our utility of consumption and the resource endowment that we have. And in strong sustainability, we would say we would have a pathway both for conserving our utility and conserving our resources. So we'll keep both of them in place. In weak sustainability, we would say, okay, we only care about our utility. We'll trade off using up resources. We'll live in a more polluted world, but our lives will be better off. We'll fish out the ocean. We'll fish out whales because that's how we're lighting our homes at that time. We're going to kill all the whales, but we're going to be able to live inside with light. We're going to use up coal. We're going to use up oil so that we can drive more now. And in the future, there'll be other fuels, and people will just be able to replace out. Their utility will be replaced, will be going up or conserved, but different resources will be used. We'll use up the old growth redwood. It will be put into people's decks now, but in the future, they'll use recycled plastic for their decks or something else. Here's a joke with thinking about weak sustainability. So you guys know the movie WALL-E, right? So in WALL-E, the planet gets destroyed. So WALL-E is the little lone robot left on the destroyed planet Earth. And all the human beings are going through space in their easy chair, drinking the soda, looking at the screen. So the utility of these people is maintained while the resource of Earth is destroyed. So just to think about, in an extreme case, what do we think? What's the right amount that just maintaining utility and keeping people happy is relevant? And this is sort of an extreme case, but it's also relevant to our discussions about what we're doing with carbon. Like there's some that environmental economics can do to change the price of carbon and have carbon trading so that we can steer the pathway of the ship away from destroying the planet. But at some point, we also need behavior change, right? We can't just do it with prices alone. At some point, we need to have choices. People make actually different choices. So in thinking about these different sustainability criteria, it really comes down to how much you can substitute. So as we go through different resources, are there substitutes that we can move into, right? We can use up old growth redwood, and we can think of something else to make our decks with. If we use up certain kinds of habitat, are there other habitat that biodiversity can live in? So there's some resources that we're going to use up, like fossil fuels. We know we're going to use those up, or we're going to draw those down below some threshold level where they would renew themselves. We're going to use up the whales in the ocean for whale oil, and they're going to grow. It's going to take them hundreds of years to grow back. We're going to use up the old growth redwood, and it's going to take them thousands of years to grow back old growth redwood. So we're substituting between resources that we deplete as we maintain our utility. And what technology pathway we're on completely determines what kind of substitution we're going to be in. So we came up with electricity, and we didn't need whale oil anymore. We're going to come up with other ways to make people's decks, and we won't need old growth redwood anymore. So the technology pathway that we're on is constantly changing our ability to substitute between things. If we want to think about our resources not as old growth redwood or fossil fuels, but we want to use them think about the resources as the clean environment. So we're polluting into this renewable resources, that's clean air, or we're polluting into Boston Harbor, right? At one point, Boston Harbor you couldn't touch it. Now, in the past couple of years, it's gotten to swimmable level. There's an interesting book that I was just looking at about the big chemical companies based in Switzerland. So 100 years ago, they had polluted Switzerland. They had polluted the Rhine River. They were making chemical dyes to replace natural dyes. And the Rhine River area in Basel, Switzerland was completely toxic. Wells were toxic. There was cancer clusters around those wells. That's over 100 years ago. That's in the 19th century. Then those chemical companies moved to the United States, and they created toxic problems in Superfund sites in New Jersey and in Pennsylvania that we're dealing with now. They're Superfund sites laden with barrels of PCBs for the next generation of chemicals. those factories, those sites are closed, and now the giant chemical companies are in China. So they're now moved the sources of where they're using resources of clean air and clean water around the world to the next place. And that's some sort of pathway of, and then China's going to wake up and get wealthier and get some sort of political reform, and then that pollution will move somewhere else in the world. So we're sort of on the strange pathway of where clean air and clean water resources are available for companies to pollute into, moving geographically around the world. So it doesn't go on forever, but so far for the past few hundred years of industrialization, there's always been room to move to the next place. Certainly in a choice about sustainability, we constantly have a choice between investment and consumption. So we can definitely think about this for how we consume our resources. So if we want to invest in a better future, if we want to invest in a livable planet, we want to invest in less cancer in children or less asthma rates in children, it might require that we decrease our current consumption. We would have less fossil fuels, we would have them at a higher price, so that we would have less air quality problems. So we can use our resources or we can leave them intact into the future. So a question for policy is how to balance this off. How can we use some resources? We need to use some of your clean air now because we need to get around and we need to generate some electricity. But how do we leave an optimal amount for future generations? The other way that perhaps China is thinking about it is, okay, we're going to take the world's pollution now. We're going to get hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. We're going to generate a whole bunch of wealth. We're going to get trillions of US dollars out of the US economy by selling them everything they want. And then we'll be on a pathway to pollute less later. We'll do what we can to use up our pollution resources now, but with the wealth that we have, we can get on a pathway to pollute less in future generations. And sometimes we're explicitly making these trade-offs, and most of the time we're sort of implicitly making these trade-offs without decision makers with policy backing making some trade-off. So we have a whole bunch of questions on how we could measure this, if we wanted to plot a pathway, if we wanted to plot where we should be on a pathway, or how different countries with different policies are on different pathways. This is very difficult, and I'll talk about this more in the next class when we talk about green GNP. It's hard to make an index that has a bunch of different attributes in it. We know how to stack up things with dollars. We have a lot of ways to stack up things with dollars, but in a lot of resources, in renewable resources, in clean air, how do we measure values for things like that? Difficult to add them in to the indexes that we already have. And we have different parts of the world. So in the north, forests are growing. In the south, forests are still being cut down and shrinking. And how do we compare values for temperate forests and tropical forests? Do they have different values? They have different carbon values, and we can talk about that later. The value of growing a tropical forest versus the value of growing a temperate forest in terms of the amount of carbon you can get for it are very different. But if we have other attributes relating to resources that come in or out of them, and certainly biodiversity loss. This is something that's never really changed. It's only increased. So we talked about this in Endangered Species Act. We have a few big species that we've saved, right? We've saved some wolves. We've saved some bald eagles. We have some marquee species that, look, we've returned it to a healthy population. But the pace of overall loss of species, numbers of species, has only increased. So there's some things that we can show that are reversed. Clean air comes back. Clean, Superfund sites mitigate pollution areas in New Jersey. But in the terms of biodiversity and species on the planet, this is something that we only have lost. Another big one is this interest rate question, which was on the last problem set, hopefully motivating thinking about that. What is the right rate to discount future generations? And this, when we're using up resources, when we're deciding on consumption now versus leaving resources for other generations, this is really going to drive your answer. If you use some low rate, 1%, 2%, you're going to value a whole bunch more that there's something there for future generations. In the problem set, we saw that there's this annualized stream from year that goes into infinity, and what interest rate you have on that infinite stream really is going to drive the result. If we use market rates, 5%, 6%, a lot of economic decisions are going to be developed now, consumed now, industrialized now. And so what is an interest rate that makes sense for sustainability would be a lot different than the interest rate that is making sense in financial markets and people making decisions about what resources to exploit and what plants to build. So one way to think about some of this, and this is to spin us into carbon, is that when we're thinking about risks in the future, we have a way that we do this in our economy already, which is insurance problems. We have a whole bunch of math. We have ways that we can think about the math of future risk. So and we have financial markets with trillions of dollars in this now. We have markets where people are buying and selling and trading risk down to the micro nanosecond. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has some predictions of future risk if we do nothing that are potentially catastrophic, right? Like the planet will be unusable, or the planet will have huge effects on our economy through really terrible weather events. So we're planning now, thinking how we're going to plan the future of our economy, how we're going to plan, if we're a big multinational corporation, how we're going to plan going forward. And we have insurance payments that we can do for a lot of things. Already, we have a lot of insurance markets. The insurance markets are backed up by co-insurance. So there's people that just insure risks down to insurance markets. We have a whole bunch of insurance pathways to say, I will pay this much now to mitigate risk in the future. I'm a homeowner. I pay my car insurance. I pay the health insurance. I pay the home insurance. So I pay thousands and thousands of dollars each year for something that I hope that I'll never use. And I've never made a claim. If you make a claim, the rates go up, so you don't make a claim, right? So you pay thousands of dollars for something you would never use. People are already doing this. Firms are already doing this. So what's the ability for us to sort of use this to price in climate uncertainty? Right now, we're pricing in something happening to my car, something happening to my health, my house burning down. We have ways that have actuarial tables of the likelihood of those events happening. So if we had really good climate models, can we sort of build prices for climate insurance into the future? So we'll talk about carbon markets. We're going to do a new form of marginal abatement cost. So we've already looked at marginal abatement cost in the chapter 12 kind of thing, and there's a new one that I want to motivate that's a carbon marginal abatement cost. And then we will talk about the trading that's happened so far in the European Union. So they started trading on carbon markets, and they've been doing it for a longer time. And then California's starting a market right now, last year and this year. And this is it's just going into place right now. So I could put the slide on the first day, but just to start this out, I want to assume that everybody believes that humans are causing climate change, and it's causing huge economic damages. We can measure damages, we can predict damages, sea level rise, climate variability, storms, droughts, floods. I want to think that you all believe this, and we can put billions of dollars price tag on this, and we can link it to carbon. Unfortunately, in Washington, D.C., it's not like a foregone conclusion. There's some huge number of congressmen and senators that wouldn't make it past this slide. But you guys are in Berkeley, so you came to school, you knew this slide. So here we are, we're in 2014. Our parts per million are going to get to 400 this year, right? We think there was something about 350 parts per million. That would be a sustainable thing that would limit sea level rise, but we're up at 400. You know, we're on a path that's going like this. If we had environmental economics, we're like, can we get some other path? But it's not going to go down to this right yet. You know, this is real time. We can measure this. We can see it happening. When we talk about carbon markets, we think about it's super disaggregated. It's very hard to measure who's polluting what, where, how much pollution is getting done, how to measure like somebody planting a tree in China versus somebody idling at a stoplight in California. We just know that there's this outcome. We have really good data on this outcome, like a global mixed blended outcome. To track things down into actual carbon outputs is very difficult. But anyways, we're at 400 now. There hasn't been any turn to this curve yet, right? When will we ever see this be at a different slope? And then, so we have a whole bunch of models going on, right? And our models are going to be linked to what we can do about it. Can we get, you know, so we're here, and in the next century, can we get on some other pathway? Can we get that graph to turn a little bit? This, there's a whole bunch of ways to think about it. So this is surface warming. This is the amount of warming that we get, right? We don't, there's all these different linkages. There's tons of carbon that are going to parts per million in the atmosphere, and then parts per million atmosphere to the actual warming itself, right? So we can have pretty good models, and there's a bunch of different scenarios here. You know, the high emission, this is the do nothing scenario. This is medium scenario. We try to steer things gently. This is probably everything that I talk about today will probably get us on some pathway like green. A blue pathway would be some sort of lower emissions. We're going to use environmental economics and put a really high price on carbon to get some lower, more stable pathway. And commitment is like everybody in the world gets together, does something actively, and does behavior change. So we think that, you know, in terms of how much sea level rise could the planet handle without being catastrophic, 1 or 2 degrees, you probably handle it. If you get to 3 or 4 degrees, really bad things are going to happen. But, you know, translating this part into the economic damages, a whole bunch of assumptions and modeling there. You know, we can model the science part out, but to model the catastrophe has been difficult. How do you model superstorms and hurricanes? We know how many billions of dollars superstorms and hurricanes cause, but how to model those out from this, kind of difficult. We can model where in the world it would happen, though, right? We have great satellites, we have great backup data, and if we are in these first pictures here, these are the, you know, some different ideas of what the pathways are, different scenarios. We know that it's going to have worse effects up here in the northern. There's going to be more warming in the north, in the Arctic, than in, you know, the southern hemisphere and in the center of the planet. So the, you know, Arctic's going to warm up first, apparently, but we can sort of think about which countries it's going to affect more and which bioregions and which cropping areas it's going to affect more along different scenarios. So there are still things we can model. What are the things that we can do to reduce carbon emissions, right? So we've already talked about some of them. There's so many different types of activities. There's changes in the way we manage grasslands, changes in the way we manage forests. There's changes in the way we consume energy. We can have more efficient projectors, we can have better windows, we can have reduced consumption in a whole bunch of different ways. We can have more efficient cars, we can have electric cars, hybrid cars. We can produce electricity in different ways. We can do renewable electricity, we can do nuclear electricity, we can produce electricity with coal that somehow grab the carbon out of the coal stack and stick it in the ground. We think we're going to be able to figure this out at some price. So what we do in the big policy picture is we take all of these different activities that can reduce carbon emissions, and we look at the cost to reduce a ton of carbon for each one, and then we rank them. We put them in a ranked list. So what's the cost for each different reduction? And we're going to rank them across a scale. And then the really important thing that we're trying to work on is what's the price for carbon that will get the reductions that we need. What I want to motivate as well is it's not just price later, it's also a whole bunch of other policies. Like we're not just relying on price now, so it's not clear that we're just going to rely on price going forward. So here's this curve called marginal abatement cost curve for carbon. I want to motivate this a little bit. So here we have price over here, so dollars per ton of carbon on the vertical axis going up. This horizontal axis is going to be actual tons, a quantity of CO2 equivalent, right? So we have a price on the vertical and a quantity on the horizontal. So this is going to be different, similar to the marginal abatement cost curve that we have, but a little bit different. We're going to have all the activities in the world that we can reduce carbon with, and they're each represented here by a little box. These are each a different thing. Each one of these boxes we've ranked. And so if we say we're starting here and we want to reduce this much, we would have a line here, like that's the amount of reduction that we needed to get. So this amount of reduction we need to get to. And then we can, if we use that line, then we can read a price off that we would need to have a price for carbon to get this level of reduction. So what about all these activities down here? What does this corner represent? Anybody tell me what's happening here? The price is less than 0. Well, actually, no. Carbon sequestration, I'm going to say is up here. But carbon sequestration will be throughout. Many of these activities would have carbon sequestration. It costs a negative amount to reduce carbon down here. Anybody tell me what that would mean? So ostensibly, all these activities, these first